All right, so I want to do some sample questions for Chapter 11 now, so you have an idea of what you'll see in your Chapter 11 assignment. So I have 4 sample questions here. So athletes who had suffered cracked ribs were randomly assigned to one of 2 exercise programs. The first group returned to sports activity in a mean of 63.8 days. Those assigned to the second program returned to sports in a mean of 51.7 days. Identify whether the above research is an observational study or an experiment. Remember from the previous video, the big difference between an observational study and an experiment is that in an experiment, the participants, in this case the people, are imposed a treatment. They are not just simply observed. These people were randomly assigned to one of these exercise programs. So they were imposed treatment. In this case, the treatment was an exercise program. So this is definitely an experiment and not an observational study. Identify the subject study. Those, again, are the participants. It says it right there at the beginning of the first sentence, athletes who had suffered cracked ribs. So those people are the participants in this study. Identify the number of treatments. So how many groups were there? There were 2 exercise programs, 2 groups, so 2 treatments. Identify the response variable measured. So notice it says the first group returned to sports activity in a mean of this many days. Second program returned to sports in a mean of 51.7 days. So it would appear that what they are trying to figure out here are how the average amount of time it takes for these athletes to return to the fields. So it's the time before returning to sports. All right. Identify whether the experiment was blind or double blind. Obviously, we would hope that the experiment was double blind, and we talked about that in the previous video. But unfortunately, in this blurb up here, it doesn't really say anything about whether it was blind or not. So we really don't know for sure whether there was any blinding or not, because it just simply doesn't say. So it is not known whether any blinding occurred. Identify the nature and scope of the conclusion regarding what the results of the experiment may or may not indicate. First thing I notice is if I look at B, it starts, since there was no randomization. Now that automatically ruins B. Okay, B has to be wrong because it clearly says in the first sentence, were randomly assigned to one of 2 exercise programs. So we know that there was randomization. So B cannot be the answer. It has to be A. Assuming that the athletes actually followed the exercise program, the experiment can help determine which of the 2 exercise programs is more effective at rehabilitating cracked ribs. All right. Now, second sample question. Let's see. This experiment involved a control group of subjects who received a placebo. Remember, a placebo is essentially a fake treatment. Why didn't the experimenters just give everyone the omega-3 fats to see if they improved? Remember, one of the things we talked about, one of the most important things regarding experiments is that they have to be comparative in nature. The best experiments are comparative in nature. So if we just gave everyone the same thing, we wouldn't have anything to compare that thing to. So by giving half the people, in this case, the omega-3 fats, and half the people the placebo, we now can do that comparison. So the answer here is A. They need to compare omega-3 results to something. Okay, third sample question. Experiment investigates a dietary approach to treating bipolar disorder. Researchers randomly assigned 28 subjects to two treatment groups, one taking a high dose of omega-3 fats, the other placebo. Why is it important to randomize in assigning the subjects to the two groups? Now, if we look at these three reasons, they all, at first glance, seem correct. But the important thing, and we talk about this a lot, is we want our results to be as unbiased as possible. So we want to eliminate, or in this case, equalize all sources of potential sources of bias or variation. So really the most important one here is B. It should equalize the effects of unknown or uncontrollable sources of variation or bias. What would be the advantages and disadvantages of using 100 subjects instead of 28? Well, obviously, we talk about how the bigger the sample size, the better. If we have a larger sample size, our results are going to be more accurate, and more accurate means less bias. So if we look at the three choices here, the one that makes the most sense is A. It would minimize the impact of individual variability or bias. And that's what we want to do, is we want to minimize it. Ideally, we would want to get rid of it we would want to get rid of it totally, the bias. But it would be a more costly and time-consuming experiment. That makes sense because more participants means more time to conduct the experiment. So the answer here is A. Okay. Number 4, last sample question. A study published in a certain medical journal cast significant doubt on suggestions that adults who drink wine have higher levels of good cholesterol and fewer heart attacks. These researchers followed a group of individuals born at a hospital between 1941 and 1969 for 21 years. Their study found that the group of adults who drank wine were richer and better educated than those who did not. That's interesting. What kind of study was this? An experiment or a prospective observational study? Okay. Remember, again, the difference between an observational study and an experiment. The big difference is in an experiment, you're imposed a treatment, like the one with the exercise programs. An observational study is purely observational in nature. In this case, it does not say anything that they imposed treatment or not. They didn't force people to drink wine. So this is a prospective observational study. They were not forced to do anything. They simply observed what happens and studied the data. Can studies such as these prove causation, that wine helps prevent heart attacks, that drinking wine makes one richer, and so on? Explain. Okay? This is an observational study. The only things that can prove causation, cause effect, are experiments. So an observational study cannot prove causation, cause effects. So studies of this type can prove none of these. The answer here is B. Okay. And that is it for the sample questions for Chapter 11. You should now be able to do